Thought 6 in the morning, the kind of stillness that only exists on a Texas ranch was shattered by my phone screaming at me. And when I picked up, it wasn't a buddy calling to go fishing or a deputy reporting a fender bender. It was 911 dispatch, sounding confused as hell, telling me that a woman had called an violent trespasser, and my own coordinates. And that's when I looked out the window and saw her, Stella Vance, standing by my gate in a pantsuit that probably cost more than my first tractor, pointing a manicured finger at my porch like she was reclaiming the promised land. Now, my name is Silas Thorne, and for 24 years, I've carried the badge of the county sheriff. But in that moment, I wasn't an oppos. The law, I was just a tired man in a flannel shirt trying to protect the only peace my younger brother, Caleb, had ever known since he crawled out from under a Humvee in Kandahar with half a leg missing and a mind full of glass shards. Caleb doesn't do well with noise, he doesn't do well with strangers, and he sure as hell doesn't do well with entitled HOA presidents who think a gated community boundary is a suggestion rather than a legal limit. But Stella didn't and oppos. Know who I was. She just saw a guy with dirt under his fingernails and a ranch that stood in the way of her son's, lifestyle needs, And as I stepped out onto that porch, feeling the cold morning air bite at my chest, I realized that some people don and oppos. Just want your land. They want your soul, and they'll use every dirty trick in the book, including their own grandkids, to get it. My ranch, the Broken Oak, sits on a prime 50-acre stretch of rolling hills and ancient timber. And for the last 6 years, it's been a sanctuary, a place where the only sounds are the cattle lowing and the wind through the tall grass, which is exactly why Caleb started sleeping through the night for the first time in a decade. But the problem with paradise is that people like the Vances always want to pave it over. Stella Vance ran the Azure Ridge estates next door like a tiny, high-heeled dictator, and her son, Julian, was a 30-something disaster with a silver spoon stuck so far down his throat he could barely breathe without his mother and oppos. As permission, but lately, Julian was in a bind, a nasty divorce, and a custody battle where the judge told him he needed a suitable, stable family environment, to see his 3 girls, and apparently, Julian decided that his mother's pool house wasn't an oppos, cutting it, and my ranch, with its barn, its horses, and its wholesome aesthetic, was the perfect prop for his courtroom drama. They didn't an oppos, asked to buy it. They didn't an oppos, offer a fair shake. They just started acting like it was already theirs, and it began with small things like accidental tire tracks through my clover fields and missing survey markers. But then it turned into something much darker, something that started keeping Caleb awake at night, clutching his old service dog like a lifeline while Julian revved his modified Raptor truck along my fence line at 2 in the morning, just to see the lights go on in our house. I tried to be the good neighbor At first, I really did, because when you've seen the worst of humanity for 2 decades in a squad car, you try to give people the benefit of the doubt. So I walked over to Stella's pristine driveway one afternoon, still in my work boots, and I told her as calmly as I could that the late-night noise was hurting my brother, that he was a decorated hero who deserved quiet. And she just looked at me through those oversized sunglasses, the kind that reflect your own tired face back at you so you can oppos. See her eyes, and she said, Mr. Thorne, you're an oppos. Brother's issues and oppos are a private matter, but my grandchildren's future is a community priority, and frankly, a man of your background doesn't an oppos. Need this much space, so why don an oppos? You make this easy and sign the intent to sell papers before the county council gets involved? I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because the sheer, unadulterated gall of this woman was a work of art. And I told her that the only way she was getting this land was if she pried it from the cold, dead hands of the United States Army. But she just smiled that thin, shark-like smile and told me that market forces have a way of moving obstacles, and that was the day the war really started. Over the next month, the Broken Oak became a crime scene that the local police refused to see, mostly because Stella had the mayor and the city attorney on her speed dial for Sunday brunch. So when my irrigation lines were sliced clean through in the middle of a July heat wave, leaving my livestock thirsty and my pastures turning to dust. The responding officer, a rookie who looked like he'd never seen a day of real dirt, just shrugged and called it, end quote, vandalism by persons unknown, end quote, even. Though Julian's truck was parked 100 yards away with a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters sitting right on the dashboard. I realized then that I couldn't and oppose fight them as Silas Thorne, the sheriff, because they just claim I was abusing my power. So I had to fight them as Silas Thorne, the rancher, the man who knew every inch of that dirt and exactly how to hide a trail camera, where even a hawk wouldn't oppose see it. I spent a week's pay on high-definition infrared units, the kind that transmit directly to a cloud server, and I tucked them into the hollows of the oaks and the eaves of the barn. And for 3 weeks, I watched a horror movie in slow motion. Julian Vance and his buddies coming onto my land at night, drinking beer, mocking the, end quote, crazy vet, end quote, in the house, and literally spray painting, end quote, future site of Vance Manor, end quote, on the side of my grandfather's equipment shed. The breaking point came on a Tuesday when I found Caleb sitting on the porch at dawn, his hands shaking so hard he dropped his coffee mug, and he pointed out toward the east pasture where the fence had been torn down, not just cut, but dragged out by a winch. And there was Julian, standing in the middle of my property with a group of suit-and-tie developers, pointing at my barn and laughing about how they'd, end quote, burn the old shack, end quote, to make room for a saltwater pool. I walked out there, my heart thumping a heavy, rhythmic beat against my ribs, and Julian just smirked and said, end quote, "Hey Silas, just doing a walkthrough. My mom says the eminent domain filing is almost through because of the end oppos, public interest in oppos, in expanding the estate's drainage basin. So you might want to start packing that in oppos, or hero in oppos, of yours into a van," end quote. And that was the moment the, end quote, sheriff, end quote, and me took a back seat to the, end quote, big brother, end quote, but I didn't and oppos, swing, I didn't and oppos. I just pulled out my phone and started recording his face, his shoes on my grass, and the exact position of the sun. I knew something they didn't and oppos. I knew that Stella's, end quote, legal connections, end quote, only went as far as the county line, and I'd spent the last 24 hours talking to a woman named Clara, Julian's ex-wife, who was hiding out in a different state because she was terrified of what Stella would do if she found out Clara was talking to the, end quote, hillbilly, end quote, next door. Clara told me everything, and it was uglier than I ever imagined. Julian wasn't an oppos. Just a spoiled brat. He was a predator who had been caught embezzling from his mother's HOA funds to pay off gambling debts, and the whole, end quote, custody battle, end quote, was a sham. He didn't oppose. Wanted the kids. He wanted the trust fund that unlocked only if he had primary custody and end quote, landed estate, end quote, in his name. And Stella was covering the whole thing up, using her HOA influence to launder the missing money into, end quote, land acquisition, end quote, fees. Armed with that, I didn't and oppose. Go to the local cops. I went to the State Bureau of Investigation and a buddy in the FBI's white-collar division, and we set a trap that was so simple, it was beautiful. I stopped fixing the fences. I stopped yelling at Julian. I even let him think I was broken, and then I invited Stella over for end quote, final negotiation, end quote, on a Saturday afternoon, making sure to tell her that I was, end quote, ready to concede, end quote, if the price was right, and she showed up looking like she'd already won the lottery, clutching a folder of lowball contracts and smelling of victory and expensive gin. We sat on my porch, and I let her talk, let her call my brother end quote, drain on the community's vitality, end quote, let her brag about how she'd, end quote, bought and paid for, end quote, the local zoning board, and all the while, the microphone in my pocket was catching every single word in crystal clear digital audio. And just as she was leaning in to tell me that I had 24 hours to vacate or she'd have a sheriff's department, my department, evict me for, end quote, public nuisance, end quote, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. My deputy, a man named Miller who had been with me since he was 20, stepped out in full uniform, followed by 2 state troopers, and the look on Stella's face when Miller walked up, tipped his hat to me, and said, end quote, "Morning, Sheriffy. You got the warrants for the Vance residence and the HOA office ready for your signature," end quote, was a moment of pure cinematic justice that I will carry to my grave. Her jaw didn't an oppose. Just drop. It practically hit the porch boards, and she looked at me, then at the badge Miller was holding, then back at me, her voice trembling as she stammered, end quote. "You the sheriff? But you live in a shack?" End quote. And I just leaned back, took a slow sip of my cold coffee, and said, end quote, "Actually, Stella, I'm the guy who's been documenting your son's felony trespassing, your witness tampering, and your little embezzlement scheme for the last 6 weeks. And since you're so fond of oppos, market forces and oppos, you'll be happy to know that the market for orange jumpsuits is currently at an all-time high." End quote. The fallout was a scorched earth event for the Vance family. Julian was picked up 3 hours later at a bar, crying like a baby when they slapped the cuffs on him for felony criminal mischief and fraud, and Stella found out that her, end quote, friends, end quote, on the zoning board had very short memories once the FBI started asking questions about where the Azure Ridge maintenance fees were actually going. The Broken Oak is quiet again now, and Caleb is back to working with the horses, his hands steady and his nights peaceful, but the Azure Ridge Estates is a mess of, end quote, for sale, end quote. Signs and lawsuits as the residents realized their HOA president was robbing them blind to fund a private land grab. I still see the developers occasionally, lurking near the gate, but they dawn into oppos. Stay long once they see the sheriff's cruiser in the driveway. And sometimes I wonder if people like Stella ever truly learn, or if they just move on to the next, end quote, obstacle, end quote, they think they can crush with a checkbook and a sneer. But here's the thing that sticks with me, and the reason I'm telling you this. We live in a world where people think that if you're quiet, you're weak, and if you live simply, you're stupid. But there's a specific kind of danger in pushing a man who has nothing to lose but his brother's peace. Stella Vance thought she was the queen of the county because she had a law degree and a gated entry. But she forgot that the law ISN and oppos, a weapon you own. It's a tool that eventually cuts the hand of anyone who tries to swing it for the wrong reasons. And now she's sitting in a cell wondering how end quote, hillbilly, end quote, in a flannel shirt took down her entire empire. It makes me wonder, though, did I go too far? Was using my position and my connections to trap them just as manipulative as what they did to me? Or is that just what justice looks like when they, end quote, good guys, end quote, finally decide to stop playing by the rules of people who don in oppos? Do you have any? I'd love to know what you think, because from where I'm sitting on this porch, watching the sun set over 50 acres of land that's staying exactly the way it is, it feels like the world is a little bit more balanced today. But maybe I'm just biased by the smell of the rain and the sound of my brother laughing in the barn. Drop a comment below. Would you have stayed quiet and build a case, or would you have lost your temper the moment they touched your family? Let's talk about it, because sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to let them think they've won right up until the moment the floor disappears from under them.